Hello and welcome to our tutorial. So in this tutorial we're going to do a little bit of sculpting. We're not going to get anything completed, but we're just going to have a look at some techniques. Normally you would sculpt before you would add a rig or do posing, but we've just gone through process so far to kind of get ourselves to some basic understandings. So I'm kind of in this taking a step or two backwards. So I'm going to start by selecting my skeleton and going into pose mode. Press A to select all, and then Alt or and Alt G, which is to undo or reset location and rotation. Then I'm going to go to object mode and press H to hide that skeleton. So I'm going to take my mesh here and I'm going to go into edit mode and let's have a quick look at our skeleton. So this is our character here. If I press A, I will get, let's just turn off the lens here. So I'm going to get an idea by looking in the bottom right corner here of how many vertices are in this object. So there's 2,300 vertices in this object. So what we want to do is we want to create an object that we can use in the game. So we want to keep the poly or the vertex count low, but what we also want to do is have enough geometry to sculpt, to be able to move things around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to object mode, have a look here at our modifier. So we have a subsurface modifier. So when I'm in object mode, you can see the verts have jumped to 9,200, and then if I change this view setting, they've gone up to 36,000. So I'm going to hit apply to that, and now this model has 36,000 verts. If I jump back into edit mode, you can see that there's a lot more geometry. Now still by kind of global standards, this is not a lot of geometry. We could easily go up to millions of verts, but this will be our starting point for sculpting. Okay. So let's jump in. So before I do any sculpting, I'm just going to try and define some edges here. I could do this through a sculpt, or I can do it just through polygon editing. So I'm going to start with some polygon editing. I'm going to go into edit mode, and we're going to have a look at the sleeve here of the character. So I'm going to hold down press Alt A to deselect everything. Hold down the Alt key and right click to select a loop. I'm going to press S for scale, and I'm going to select this and scale this up. And then what I'm going to do is press Control or, which is a loop cut, put this here, and then press S again for scaling down. And then I'm going to press G to move this in here. So we've sort of repeated the process that we had at the sleeve, or at the kind of the joining of the glove and the arm. So I'm going to add in a loop cut here and a loop cut here, so that it has quite a clear definition. Now we haven't got a mirror modifier on this, so we're going to have to do this on the other side. So we're around here. If it's not exactly symmetrical, we will survive. So I'm going to scale this up and scale this up. So this is just the same process I've done on the other side. Control or for a loop, press S for scale, G to move it in, and then we'll do two more loop cuts. So Control or here and Control or here. So, and we can see they're not symmetrical, but that's okay for what we're doing. The last one I'm going to do is I'm just going to do something similar here. So I'm going to go Control or, add in a loop cut, and scale this in a little bit. And press G and Z and move this down. And then take this one and scale it in slightly. Okay. So then we have a joining between at the torso, and then the last one we'll do one around here at the neck. So this is, like I said, we could we could add in these seams using sculpting, or simply using polygon editing. So I'm going to go G, Z, and move this down, and then press S and scale out a bit, and scale that on Y fractionally, and okay, and the last thing we'll do is we'll select both of these, whoops, and I'm going to press E for extrude, S for scaling out, and I'm going to select this inner loop here and go GZ, and just make sure it's, yeah, all good. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to scale in the neck a little bit, and because it's a bit too so I'm scaling it on X. It's just a little bit wide. I'm going to turn on my proportional editing and scale on X, and then scale on X again, but this time I'm going to roll out with the mouse so I get a larger kind of area. Okay, so this is going to be our starting point for our sculpt. So I'm just going to save that. I'm going to go File, Save. Now we're going to do a little bit of sculpting just to show you sort of some basic techniques and the tools involved. So with the mesh selected, I'm going to go into sculpt mode. Now a couple of things to notice. When I go into sculpt mode, all of my tools change here, so I get to choose which tool I want to sculpt with. We will have a look at how we kind of look at the object. So at the moment our shading is solid, but by holding down the shading menu here, I'm going to pick matte cap, which is material, and we get to pick what material we want to use. So I'm going to pick this one here, and we'll just make everything easier to see. You'll also see that everything has been slightly triangulated, so we're getting a few lines here, but we can go back and fix them later. Now, there's a couple of different ways to sculpt, so two basic ways. So I can add in what's called a multi-resolution modifier, and using that I can add in lots of geometry, like maybe a couple of 100,000 verts, and basically it just subdivides and subdivides the mesh. But that equally adds geometry over the whole mesh. So maybe I don't want lots of detail here in the in the forearm, but I do want extra detail in the face. So it sort of distributes, that multi-resolution modifier distributes geometry equally throughout the whole mesh, regardless of what areas I want detail and what areas don't need detail. So instead of doing that, what we're going to do is we're going to turn on this tool here called Dynamic Topology. And it's giving us a warning. It says if you do that, you'll lose other information. So I'm okay with that. I'm going to hit OK. So you can see we've been set to shading of flat, but we can easily fix that. But also when we draw now, or when we sculpt, instead of just moving the geometry that's here, we'll be adding in new geometry. So let me just give you an example of that. I'm going to go to clay strips, and I'm going to press the F key to set the size of my brush. I can also set it up here, and I can draw onto the mesh, and more geometry has been added. In fact, the rate at which geometry is added is based on how zoomed in and zoomed out you are. So if I zoom in and then I draw, and zoom in and draw again, you can see that the size of the polygons that are added is relative to the scale of the viewport. And equally, if I draw on top of this now, it will remove all of the underlying detail. So I'm going to press Ctrl Z a couple of times to get rid of that. I'm also just going to point out that up here in the top right hand corner we've got symmetry setup. So I've got it set to an X mirror symmetry. So whatever I draw on this side will be matched on that side of the model, assuming the model is symmetrical on the x-axis. So what are we going to do? We're going to work on the premise that we have some sort of sci-fi kind of character, and we're going to do a little bit of sculpting. We're going to put in sort of a set of shoulder pads, and we'll add in a belt or something. So just something simple for now, and then we'll do more sculpting at a later date. So keeping in mind that this is not symmetrical, so this sleeve is longer than this one. If I want to put in a shoulder pad here, if I put it all the way across, I'll end up drawing on the top of the arm here. So I'm just going to make it small to avoid that. Or I could draw one here and then turn off the symmetry lock like that, and then draw them completely, you know, as two separate items. But for convenience, we won't do that. So I'm going to press F and zoom in, and the first thing I'm going to do is just draw, with clay strips selected, the very kind of crude outline of this shoulder pad that I want to add in. If I feel like I'm not adding enough geometry to my model, I can increase the strength of the brush, and then more geometry will be added at a faster rate. Okay, so now I can hold down the Shift key while I'm sculpting, and I will start to smooth the area that I have sculpted. I can also use this tool here, Mask. So I'm going to press F now, make it a little bit smaller. So as I draw here, you can see that the color of the geometry, regardless of what material is there, is changing. And this is called a mask. And what the mask is for is the mask will prevent me from changing the geometry with the sculpt tools that has changed color. So if I make a shape using the mask here, then as I sculpt inside that shape, none of the, like if I get to the border while I'm sculpting, then none of the adjacent geometry will be affected by the tools that I'm using. And this can be a really helpful tool to try and avoid undoing good work. So I'm going to go back to clay strips, and I'll draw in here, and I'll just show you if I draw over the edge, it isn't the mask kind of protects the outer area of the model. Now I'm just holding down the Shift key and smoothing it out a bit. And we can see we've got that on both sides. Now if I wanted to make some finer detail, if I press F here, let's say I wanted to make a smaller ridge on the inside here. If I hold down the Control key, I will invert the brush. So I'm just going to undo that because I slipped. So and when I say invert the brush, instead of adding extra geometry, I'm now subtracting geometry. Again, I can increase the strength, and that will be duplicated over here. So the scale at which we draw is determined by how far zoomed in we are. So if I zoom in here and I want to add something that looks like maybe the top of a bolt or a screw, I can do that quite convincingly. Now the sculpt tools are not like polygon editing, so you're not going to get like completely straight lines. That's not what this process is for. If you want a perfect circle, then you would make a circle. So this is for more sort of organic shapes. You do have some tools like crease and pinch, which will make the outline of something a little more defined to add sort of wanted detail sort of around, like, so if this was a screw or a bolt, we would probably have a minor sort of indentation going all around it. So it is very possible to add very fine levels of detail if you want, simply by zooming in on the model. To get rid of the mask, when we're finished with it, we can select the mask, and then, as with all the other brushes, I can hold down the control key, and it inverts the mask, and I can literally rub it out. And then the area that was once covered by the mask is now, I'm free to draw on top of that. Okay, I'll just do one more thing, which is we'll add in a belt here, or just to show. So we're going to start with the mask this time. So I'm going to mask this top area so that I can't affect any of the geometry in this middle section here. I'm going to press Control 1, and Control 1 is, when I press 1, obviously I look at from front view, but Control 1 is look at it from the rear. And okay, so now I'm going to go back to my clay strips. Actually, let's mask here, and press 1 and 3, Control 1 and Control 3 for this side, and now I'm going to go back to my clay strips. So now I can sculpt, and so you can see that I've kind of restricted the area where I'm drawing. So now I can press F, make this bigger, hold down Control and remove the mask. And while this is not what a belt would look like, it does sort of demonstrate that you can get a straight line sort of on the sculpt if you so desire. So while this is not a beautiful product here, this is just the start of something. All we're really doing is having a look at the tools that are available to us, and there's quite a few more for us to explore, but that's enough for this tutorial.